He didn't eat. He didn't move. He just waited for one perfect shot. The mountains around Grozny were silent except for the wind, a thin, constant whisper brushing across the ruins. Snow clung to the edges of shattered walls and twisted rebar. The war had burned everything but the cold. In a trench of half-frozen clay, a single man lay face down, motionless except for the slow rise of his breath. His name was Andrey Kovalenko, 27 years old, marksman of the 245th Motor Rifle Regiment. Somewhere beyond the ridge ahead, in the broken skeleton of an apartment block, was his target, a rebel commander whose orders had cost dozens of lives. The mission had no backup, no radio link, no spotter. Just coordinates scratched on a piece of laminated paper and an unspoken order: wait as long as it takes. The first crawl began before dawn. Kovalenko had moved only 30 meters in an hour, pushing his rifle ahead of him, one elbow at a time. The mud was half ice, half oil. Each movement made a sound, a wet, slow tear. He waited for wind gusts or the far echo of artillery before shifting again, synchronizing motion with noise until he melted into the terrain itself. By midday, his uniform was indistinguishable from the earth. His face was smeared in soot, his rifle wrapped in strips of torn fabric. He could taste the diesel in the soil. He felt the tremor of distant tank tracks through his chest. Every vibration became a signal. Patrols moving, shells landing, life continuing beyond the stillness he had chosen. Behind him, the Russian lines were 2 kilometers away. Ahead, the city stretched like a burnt skeleton. Concrete ribs, hollow windows, 1,000 places for a man to hide. The Chechen positions were invisible from his angle, but the command brief had shown one thing: a courtyard used as a command relay point. Radio intercepts traced enemy movement through that single node. Somewhere inside, among dozens of fighters, was one man in charge. The first day was survival. Kovalenko built a shallow pit beneath a layer of frozen grass, covered himself with it like a shroud, and waited. The world around him moved in slow, fractured rhythms. A patrol crossing a street, a truck engine starting, a dog barking, then silence again. Every sound had distance, texture, and purpose. He measured time by shadows and hunger. When the sun fell, he drank melted snow through a piece of cloth to filter mud. When it rose, he resumed the stillness. The mission wasn't about marksmanship. It was about endurance, the ability to become less than human, to vanish into patience itself. He thought of nothing but breath and line of sight. By the evening of the first day, frost had sealed the edges of his gloves. His fingertips no longer felt the trigger guard. A mosquito crawled along his cheek. He didn't flinch. A sniper could survive hunger, thirst, even cold, but not movement. Movement betrayed everything. He knew the math of invisibility. The eye detects motion first, contrast second, shape last. If he never moved, he could be a rock. So he became one. Night descended over the city like smoke. The sky glowed faint orange from distant fires. Tracer rounds cut faint streaks through the dark. Somewhere far behind, artillery thumped once, twice, then quiet again. He listened, eyes half closed, heartbeat steady. Sleep came in fragments, 1 minute at a time between breaths. He dreamed of home only in textures. The sound of rain on tin, the smell of bread, the warmth of a stove. None of it seemed real. The only reality was the crosshair and the silence. When dawn came, the air was so cold it stung to inhale. Kovalenko exhaled slowly to avoid steam rising from his mouth. Through his scope, he studied the ruined courtyard, empty, gray, lifeless. But in one window a curtain moved, not from wind, from habit. Someone was there. He logged the pattern. Every 20 minutes, the curtain swayed. Someone inside was checking the street. He noted the reflection of metal, maybe binoculars. He didn't shoot. Not yet. One shot wasted would end everything. He waited to see who looked through that curtain. Hours passed. The sun arced behind cloud. Snow began to fall, thin flakes drifting like ash. It covered his rifle, his hood, his face. He let it. The snow disguised even the rise and fall of his chest. In the distance, a group of figures crossed the street. Rebels for maybe 5. He watched them through the lens, each detail frozen in magnified clarity. Unshaven faces, mismatched uniforms, one man limping, another smoking. They carried ammunition boxes into the building with the curtain. That was the confirmation he needed. The commander was inside. Kovalenko adjusted elevation, a fraction of a degree, then stopped. Not yet. He needed to learn their rhythm. A sniper kills time before he kills a target. He waited for dusk again. As the second night began, the cold thickened. Wind pressed against his back. His water supply froze solid inside its canister. He chipped small shards with a knife and let them melt on his tongue. His lips bled from the salt of the soil. The pain helped him stay alert. Every few hours, a flare lit the skyline, green, then red, illuminating ruined stairwells, broken antennae, a cat darting across debris. He used each flash to scan new angles through his scope. The rebels had guard rotations every 4 hours. They used the same path each time, a mistake born from routine. That pattern would be their undoing. At 2 o'clock, he spotted the commander for the first time. The man stepped into the window with the curtain. Broad shoulders, heavy jacket, fur collar. He leaned over the sill, smoking, watching the dark. For 5 seconds, Kovalenko could see his face, sharp, deliberate, unaware. Then he vanished again. 5 seconds. That was all. Enough to calculate range, 640 meters. Enough to fix a memory, face, height, outline. But not enough to shoot. The sniper checked wind direction using a thread tied to his barrel. It fluttered toward the west. He recalculated, memorized corrections, then settled the scope again. But the target didn't reappear. The window stayed dark. The only movement was the trembling of candlelight through cracks in the glass. He lay back, resting his head on the frozen earth. His body temperature dropped, heart rate steadying near 50 beats per minute. He had been in position for 36 hours. A fox wandered into the field nearby. It sniffed the ground, tilted its head, and stared directly toward him. Kovalenko held his breath. The animal froze, unsure. Then it turned and vanished into the trees. The moment passed. By dawn, frost had sealed his clothing to the mud. He couldn't tell where fabric ended and ground began. The scope was rimed with ice. He wiped it with a cloth and resumed his vigil. The city ahead began to stir. Figures moving, smoke curling from barrels, voices faint under the wind. He listened to their patterns like music, short, nervous, mechanical. He waited for the wrong note. The second day bled into the third without meaning. Time had no form, only intervals between breaths. Hunger no longer hurt, it simply hollowed. The line between man and environment dissolved. His senses sharpened in strange ways. He could tell distance by echo, recognize footsteps by weight. The city spoke through vibrations, and he understood it. At noon, distant gunfire erupted, not near his target, but behind his line. Russian troops clashing on another front. The sound echoed through valleys, drawing some rebels to higher ground. For hours, their attention shifted. He remained invisible. At sunset, the light dimmed into copper haze. The curtain in the window moved again. Not a hand this time, but a figure stepping fully into view. The same man. The commander. He held a radio, speaking to someone outside. Kovalenko's pulse quickened once, then steadied. His world narrowed to a circle of glass and crosshairs. Wind calm. Distance. Confirmed. Light. Fading. He exhaled, long, steady, until lungs felt empty. The scope trembled slightly with heartbeat. He adjusted his grip, one finger over the trigger, pressure building in slow motion. But then motion below. A civilian woman crossed the yard, carrying water in a metal pot. She passed directly between him and the window. For 10 seconds, the commander was shielded. 10 seconds that changed everything. He eased his finger away. Waited. The woman disappeared into another doorway. The window closed. The opportunity was gone. The sniper stayed still. Hours passed. He didn't fire, because patience, not precision, was what made a sniper immortal. When the third morning came, frost covered everything. The world was silent again, the kind of silence that feels heavy, stretched thin between breaths. The air was dry, brittle, sharp enough to cut skin. Kovalenko had stopped counting the hours. Time had become irrelevant, replaced by instinct. His body was stiff, muscles locked from the cold. Each joint ached. Every heartbeat felt loud. The mission brief had mentioned one detail. The commander would appear only to oversee supply deliveries. Kovalenko had seen none for 2 days. That meant one was due. At 9 o'clock, a faint rumble reached through the valley. A truck, old, diesel engine, coughing black smoke as it approached the ruined complex. Through his scope, Kovalenko watched the vehicle stop near the courtyard. Men emerged, 5, maybe 6. They unloaded crates, ammunition boxes, sacks of rice. Then came the man in the fur-collared coat, the same one from the window. He was giving orders, pointing toward the east wall, gesturing with precision. His posture was calm, habitual, like someone used to control. Around him, the men moved quickly, nervous. Kovalenko watched through the lens, adjusting for distance. He could feel the pulse in his neck. He had the shot. But the commander never stood still, always moving, always shielded. Guards passed constantly in front of him, breaking the line of sight. Firing now risked everything. Kovalenko's discipline held. He followed the target with his scope, breathing shallow, waiting for that one perfect frame of stillness. A moment between steps, between turns, between the heartbeat and the next. Then, abruptly, the wind shifted. A low gust blew from behind him, carrying the scent of earth and oil toward the target area. One guard paused, sniffed the air, scanning the slope. Kovalenko froze. Even at 600 meters, a trained fighter could detect what didn't belong. A faint shimmer, a glint of glass. He waited for the gaze to pass. The guard stared, frowning. Then a voice called from behind, and he turned away. Kovalenko exhaled, slow, silent. He adjusted again. The window from the previous days was now open. The commander entered the building and disappeared from view. Minutes passed. No sound, no movement. Then a shadow inside, a hand setting down a radio, a head leaning into the window frame. Kovalenko steadied the rifle. He aligned the crosshair just beneath the left temple. The angle was steep but clean. The wind was calm again. He calculated drop. -6 centimeters for 640 meters. He inhaled once through his nose, exhaled through his mouth, and pressed the trigger halfway, holding tension like a held breath in winter air. His finger moved the final millimeter. The rifle cracked, one dry, controlled shot. The recoil was gentle, precise. Through the scope, he saw the figure drop instantly, collapsing forward out of frame. No splash, no scream, just motion and then stillness. For a moment, the world didn't react. Birds didn't scatter. The wind didn't shift. It was as if sound itself had been erased. Then chaos. Shouts. Men running into the yard. One knelt beside the fallen body, waving his arms frantically. Another pointed toward the hills. The first sniper's rule: never fire twice from the same position. Kovalenko packed his rifle with mechanical calm, movements rehearsed 1,000 times. He folded the bipod, wrapped the sling, and began the crawl backward, inch by inch, through mud that had turned to stone. Each second stretched into eternity. He heard the whine of a distant machine gun burst, random, directionless. They were firing blind into the hillside. He ignored it, kept crawling. His body blended with snow and rock, invisible from 100 meters. The rebels fired at ghosts. He didn't look back. By the time the sun began to set, he had crossed half the valley, moving so slow that even snow falling on his back didn't slide off. His world had narrowed to the rhythm of his breath and the feel of frozen soil beneath his chest. The shot was behind him now, part of the silence again. That night he reached a dry creek bed. There he rested, finally lifting his head for the first time in 3 days. His lips cracked as he drank melted frost from the hollow of his hand. He checked the rifle, 1 bullet fired, chamber clean. Mission complete. But there was no celebration, no emotion, just exhaustion, deep and heavy, like the ground itself pulling him inward. He waited until full darkness before standing. His knees trembled from disuse. Every movement felt alien, mechanical. He started walking slow, cautious steps through the snow, using the faint glow of the northern sky as guide. Behind him, the city flickered with gunfire, brief flashes like dying stars. Ahead, only the mountains, black silhouettes against a pale horizon. Hours later, he reached the rendezvous ridge. The Russian lines were somewhere beyond, but there were no signals, no lights. He found an abandoned outpost, a collapsed bunker half buried in frost. Inside, a field radio lay broken, its wires gnawed by rats. He didn't try to fix it. There was nothing left to say. He slept sitting upright, rifle across his knees. When dawn came, snow covered him again. He looked down at his boots. The soles had frozen through. His body had become part of the landscape. For a moment, he wondered if anyone even knew he was alive. Then he smiled faintly because it didn't matter. His job had been to wait, to endure, to end a pattern of violence that had claimed too many of his comrades. And he had done it with 1 breath, 1 bullet, 1 perfect silence. When Kovalenko returned to base 2 days later, his face was gray with frostbite. His uniform had hardened into a crust of ice and dirt. The sentries didn't recognize him at first, just another ghost crawling out of the snow. He handed over his rifle and walked straight to the mess tent, where steam rose from a metal kettle. He drank in silence. No one asked questions. In that war, silence was its own kind of metal. Reports later confirmed the hit. The rebel commander had been killed instantly. His death fractured local coordination. The next offensive stalled for weeks. Officially, the mission was never recorded. There were no commendations, no photographs, no recognition. Only a single note in a logbook, and signed. Objective neutralized. Shooter returned. When a journalist years later asked Kovalenko what he feared most during those days, the cold, the hunger, the enemy, he thought for a long time and said only, "The itch, because if you move to scratch it, you die." That was the truth of it. Not glory, not even courage, just the endurance to remain still while the world burned around you. He died in 2011, far from any battlefield, a quiet man living in the countryside outside Ryazan. His neighbors remembered him as polite, reserved, always trimming the same patch of grass, always cleaning his tools in silence. None of them knew he had once waited 3 days in the mud for a single shot that shifted the balance of a war. On his workbench, after his death, they found a rifle scope wrapped in cloth, glass polished and clear. Inside the lid of the case was a small note, written in faded pencil. "Patience is louder than any bullet.